but we found a number of trace pieces of data that you can use here. That same clock and weather widget that I was talking about actually logs full-on GPS data on a lot of devices. There are implementations of GPS location providers that are spitting that data out. And furthermore, the underlying native libraries that tie into the GPS sets are also disclosing that. One thing to note is that these are things that typically only show up when applications are actively talking to the GPS set or at relatively coarse-grained intervals. So what good does that do? Well, I'll tell you a story, and you can decide for yourself. So this is a story about three guys who started out at their office in South Market in San Francisco. They had places to go, so they left the office. They walked down to the corner, and they hailed a cab. They got into the cab and started heading down 101 toward San Francisco International Airport. Pretty chatty cab driver. At some point, one of them got bored. Pulled up Google Maps to see how far along they were, and we got a location snapshot. We got another one near the airport. We can see actually, showing up at the terminal. These guys boarded a flight on Virgin America, and they headed to Vegas. Landed at McCarran. We have a check-in here that's essentially at the gate. Went down, got some baggage, headed across town, and came to Caesar's Palace. Here, we actually see a lot of interesting activity, which, as it happens, corresponds pretty closely when you look at this to us checking in, going up to hang out in our room for a bit, going down to register at the speaker's desk, and then going back to work on our slides till 4 o'clock in the morning so we could actually do this talk. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, and he's going to talk about something near and dear to all our hearts, which is root access to devices.
Thanks, Tim. So as hackers, we all want to strive for root on systems, and Android is no different. So we know that everyone hoped that these phones would be these amazing utopian devices that are completely open and anybody can do anything they want. But unfortunately, we know that the reality is that manufacturers and carriers are all shipping these phones locked down, so that we can't do a lot of these fun things that we'd like to. And all these people that are buying these phones, Android especially appeals to a pretty nerdy demographic. So these are the kind of people who want to kind of get down into the internals and play around with their phone. So there are entire communities that are developing around the idea of being able to root your phone so that you can mod it, put on custom images, basically do whatever you want with it. To the point where we have third-party ROMs that are available for people to install and have a lot more fun with their phones. So what are some ways that people can go about getting root on these phones? We know that Android's running on a Linux kernel. So we can take a lot of these Linux vulnerabilities that have been popping up in recent years and see if they work on the Android device. I know there have been a few in the past that people have used to be able to root some of their phones. And we can kind of just go through a lot of old databases of vulnerabilities and kind of compare them to a lot of the major releases of Android and see if any of those would apply. Here we have all the different kernel versions that each major release is using, with Gingerbread in the future ideally released in Q4 this year. That will either be using 2.6.3.3 or 3.4, depending on whatever they decide to use. Another way is we can leverage old libraries that are shipping on these systems. So there's various imaging libraries and some other stuff. that are going, they're basically shipping out the door unpatched or very old versions. You can kind of follow some of the full disclosure mailing lists and monitor some of these libraries that we know are shipping on these phones and see if any new vulnerabilities pop up on these. SUID binaries are something that most Linux systems are going to have. These have been leveraged in the past to be able to root. I believe the Evo 4G was recently rooted using vulnerable SUID binary. So, I mean, typically anything that people have been doing in the past to attack Linux are things that we can do nowadays on Android. So let's talk about something specific here. So CVE 2009-1185 was a libudev vulnerability that was reported a long time ago. It was discovered by Sebastian Kamar, and the original patch to fix this was in April of 2009, which is roughly 16 months ago. The vulnerability itself was a failed check in the netlink message, checking the origin of the message. Basically, did it come from the kernel, did it come from the user? It didn't actually care, and we could use this to, in the end result, get a privilege escalation. So we took this, or actually, so recently Sebastian dredged up this old vulnerability and wrote some code to run on Android, and so you could use ADB to upload it and run it from the file system. Turns out Android was vulnerable to it on the one he tried it on. The original release was for Droid X, I believe. So we took this and we repackaged this exploit up into some code that we could trigger with JNI, and packaged this up into an APK along with a payload of a connect-back shell to basically be able to install this on many different phones and see who exactly was vulnerable to this. So what we found is that every flagship phone of every major US carrier to this day is vulnerable to this specific exploit. We installed this on the Evo 4G, Droid X, the Incredible, a lot of these, the new latest and greatest phones that everybody wants. So at this point, we have an APK that we can install. If we leverage that with David's launch on install, we basically have a one-shot root for all these phones. Oops. So there's kind of a problem going around these things. We know that people want to have their phones rooted. They want to be able to play with them, be able to do a lot of these modifications, have fun. So these communities that are forming, they're not looking at rooting as a security thing. They're looking at this as a way for them to accomplish these goals of unlocking their phone and being able to do a lot of these modifications. What they're not acknowledging is that all of these ways that they're finding to root these phones are security vulnerabilities that people could be leveraging that don't have these altruistic intentions. And the other problem with this is that because they want to have these methods for rooting remain, and they don't want carriers or manufacturers to patch these problems, no one wants to talk about the details of these exploits. So we'll have one person distributing a binary that says, use this to root your phone, here's the instructions to install it, but not actually disclosing any of the information about what the problem is. And so this leaves basically the majority of people that aren't phone nerds and want to do this with gaping holes in their phones that anyone could leverage if they wanted to do that. So we've discussed some of the reasons people are wanting to root their phones. So the modding phones we've discussed. Another one of the problems is the patching process is slow. Android is coming out with major releases relatively fast compared to other mobile phone platforms. But the problem is that a lot of these manufacturers and the carriers are doing a lot of their own custom modifications to extend the system and add a lot more functionality on top of Android proper. And it takes them a while to take all these changes and patch them up to the latest version. And So you have people who end up buying a 1.6 phone, and 2 months later, 2.0 or 2.1 phones are available, and they don't see an update for over a year or a year and a half to be able to use that. So if they root their phone, they can install these custom images and be able to have access to the latest releases. Also, people are going to do this just for features like tethering, things that they want to be able to do that maybe their carrier doesn't provide them, or if they want to skirt around and do this without having to pay. That's another motivation. So that's kind of wraps up the problem with all the rooting, the community surrounding that. And so let's talk about some of the things that everyone can do to kind of avoid a lot of the problems that we've talked about today. As a user, we've kind of discussed that a lack of permission does not necessarily mean that the app can't do that. If you install a game that doesn't say it's accessing content data and shipping that off to some server, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not doing that. And you may see a lot of people that are inadvertently doing this kind of thing, not necessarily with malicious intents. And scrutinize the permissions that your app is requesting, and that's a pretty obvious one. But some of these permissions are pretty benign and seem fairly harmless. But ask yourself, like, does my permission really need to be able to read logs? Most likely it doesn't. Also, system updates, keep your phone patched, up to date. I mean, if you are concerned about if a rogue application does slip into the market, someone being able to root your phone and build up a mobile botnet, as other researchers have been demonstrating in the past. Hopefully they'll stay on top of this with patches. Developers, these users, when you're requesting these permissions to access a lot of their private data, they're essentially trusting you with that. So just be aware what you're doing with that. Think about the things that you're logging. If you are logging a lot of stuff for debugging, it doesn't necessarily need to be there in production code. So, I mean, you can do a lot of the things that Tim talked about of seeding in information and seeing where that propagates out to, and see if you had anything to do with that. Also, make use of the permissions in the system. If other applications don't have any reason to be receiving your intents or starting your activities, enforce a permission so that they can't do that. Also, along the same lines with the intents, don't be sending private data that the user would care about across these intents, because all these are being logged in the system. Anyone's going to be able to see that. The OEMs, you know, a lot of the same things that developers should be doing are the same things OEMs should be doing. They kind of should be setting the bar for a lot of these things. You know, because as a developer, why should you care about leaking user data if the OEM is already doing it before you did? Also, it would be nice to see better patching on some of these, keeping up to date on a lot of these libraries, making sure that if you are using an old library, make sure you have a backported patch for that to avoid some of these problems. Same with the kernels. So yeah, that wraps everything up. So if you guys have any questions.
Most of the logging examples I saw were off of HTC. Is that running with HTC since you are, or is that just a stock HTC?
So he asked if most of the things that he was being that we saw being logged were off of the stock HTC Sense UI, because he noticed a lot of the logging was from HTC stuff. Some of that stuff is, and like with the clock widget, it's things that you can remove from the screen so that you're not going to be running that anymore. But not necessarily all that stuff is going to matter if it's the HTC Sense UI.
How much is Steve Jobs paying you?
Not a dime.
There's a Nexus 1 in my pocket, so.
How many devices would you say are starting to take advantage of secure boot loading capabilities?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Secure boot loading,
a couple of devices have